Access to Democracy is made possible by donations from the following organizations. Thomson Reuters, a global company with expertise and insight to unravel complex situations in the areas of law, tax, compliance, government, and media. Their worldwide network of journalists and editors keep customers up to speed on relevant global events. Thomson Reuters, the answer company. The division championship Minnesota Twins are looking to go all the way to the World Series in 2024. Bolstered by inspirational shortstop Carlos Correa, a healthy Brian Buxton, and rookie phenom Royce Lewis, plus a pitching staff led by Pablo Lopez and an outstanding bullpen featuring Johan Duran, the Twins are the best bargain in the major leagues, and Target Field is the best venue in baseball. Sheridan Dulas & Kins, PA, a family and criminal defense law firm, has been serving clients in Dakota County and throughout Minnesota for over 40 years. Ranked a Tier 1 Best Law Firm by U.S. News and World Report every year since 2009, Sheridan Dulas & Kins are here to help you in your most difficult life circumstances. Established in 2007, 45th Parallel Spirits was among the first 50 micro-distilleries in the United States. Based in New Richmond, Wisconsin, all aspects of production occur at our facility. If you're interested in visiting and learning more about the 45th Parallel Distillery, please check our website and plan a visit to tour our facility and taste our spirits. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has proudly served its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Access to Democracy. I'm your host today, Steve Francisco. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful summer afternoon. It's a real pleasure for me to welcome back to Access to Democracy our good friend and return visitor, Dane Smith. Dane, welcome back to Access to Democracy.
Good to be here. This is one of the best public affairs programs in the Twin Cities, and I'm always happy to be here.
Why, thank you very much. So for our viewers who maybe didn't see your previous interviews, give us just a very quick synopsis, personal synopsis, where you grew up and what drew you to Minnesota, and that'll be a good segue into today's topic.
I grew up in Anchorage, Alaska. I'm a Texas native, but my parents moved up there when I was really young, so I grew up there. Went from Alaska into the U.S. Navy. And when I was in the Navy, through one of my best Navy buddies, I met his sister, and one thing led to another. We got married and decided to settle in Minnesota in 1973.
And you were drawn to Minnesota in part, you've told me, because of a particular magazine story that appeared in Time magazine. Tell us about that.
Well, I was coming here regardless.
Yeah, because you married.
Yes, because
your wife was.
This was going to be our home.
Right.
But
this helped you reaffirm your choice.
Right. But the day that I got out of the Navy, I was in the Philadelphia airport. I got discharged, the final papers that morning. So I'm in the Philadelphia airport, and I'm in the newsstand, and I see this issue of Time magazine. Now, this is famous, and it's the subject of our discussion today and my series, Reappraising Minnesota.
Says the good life in Minnesota with former Governor Wendell
Anderson holding up a, I think that is a Northern.
Northern.
Yes, and so here I am getting out of the Navy, coming to Minnesota really to live for the first time. And I don't know a whole lot about the state, but this article put us on the map in many ways. It is often referred to as iconic, overused word, but it really holds true. It describes a state that valued equality and fairness, a state that was well run, where all the children were above average.
As Garrison Keillor liked to say.
Yes, right. And it really established the term quality of life. And it made the case that Minnesota really was a distinctively good place to live. And it focused on business success, on a general level of prosperity, on progressive policies that extended this good life to all of the people in its jurisdiction. And not unique by any means, but certainly distinctive. And so over the ensuing years, I had this career in journalism. I was a reporter and writer for the Star Tribune.
Right, and the Pioneer Press.
And the Pioneer Press, right. And then, so gradually, the parts of it were exaggerated. There's omissions in this original Time magazine article. There are flaws that it didn't address. But in general, I found this to be essentially true, that we are the place for the good life.
They called us a state that works, as I recall.
Right.
Now, leading into our discussion today, you decided to revisit this subject, and you did a 10-part series for MinnPost, the online newspaper, reappraising the good life in Minnesota, a state that works. I want to lead into this with something that you said in part 2. You said the single most important demographic change for Minnesota since 1973 has been the steep growth rate in racial diversity. But you have also noted persistent racial disparities in Minnesota in education, healthcare, housing, employment, and more. Why do you think these disparities persist 50 years after this article appeared?
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons. For one thing, the rate of this growth was among the highest in the nation. We were at 2% people of color in 1973. Now we're close to 25%. That's a 12-fold increase. So that's going to put some strain on the equality proposition. Many of our immigrants were among the poorest from the Chicago and Detroit area, from East Africa, from some of the poorest regions,
Southeast
Asia. We actually, and East Africa, Somalians, you're going to have disparity with diversity when you welcome poor people into your community. We did do a good job, I think, of initially attracting and welcoming people of color and new immigrants, and it has done marvels for the state. The food's better, for one thing. The cultural scene is much more interesting.
Much more diverse.
I think Minnesota being more colorful, looking more like the rest of the world, has been easily a net plus. But we did not do as good a job as we should have in equalizing outcomes. And so here we are, a couple of generations past this mass immigration, and we still have some big disparities. But those are present in every other state too.
I've seen the changes you're talking about demographically, Dane. I remember as a child growing up in South Minneapolis, if you wanted Mexican food, there was basically one restaurant, La Casa Coronado.
Right.
And now if you drive down East Lake Street in Minneapolis, you'll find taquerias, food not just from Mexico, but from all over Central America and even South America. So the cultural scene, the food, the music, the language, it's a much more diverse place than it was 50 years ago.
More interesting, more dynamic. And this will serve us well going forward because we're in a global economy. And we have people who are, speak several languages. We have young people with great talent coming from these communities, and I think it's, in the long run, it is definitely going to serve us well.
I want to ask you about this. We hear certain politicians these days, particularly on the right, who are talking about immigrants in language that many people find reprehensible, talking about poisoning our blood, denigrating people coming from immigrants from S-hole countries, and other such language that we hear coming out of politicians who you would think ideally would be trying to unite Americans rather than dividing us. What is your reaction to this language?
Well, I think it's deplorable. These newcomers are here because they love the state like I did when I came here in 1973. I came to appreciate the opportunities here. This is why the immigrants are here. On almost every measure, crime rates, employment rate, you name it, immigrants are net contributors to our prosperity in the state. States that are not attracting immigrants are not doing as well economically. They don't have growth. They don't have this fresh This is not bad blood. This is fresh blood, and it's working for us. But we just have to do better on the thing that distinguishes Minnesota the most, and that's the equity proposition. This state has a history going back to its founding by New England progressives who were staunchly abolitionists, who stood strongly against slavery, perhaps the strongest of any state. And we passed laws earlier than any other state, making voting and other opportunities, public accommodations equal.
Right.
You continue through the farmer labor movement. This is what really is in our DNA. These folks were radical equitarians. They wanted equal pay. They wanted the fruits of capitalism to be distributed more equally.
Sounds like you're saying they didn't just want to say the slogans about equality, they actually believed in implementing them.
And we led the way on progressive legislation, from the progressive income tax, labor laws, you name it, and all of this created this good life. It was maybe a little easier to do it when everybody was Swedish or German or Anglo-Saxon. But what's really encouraging about our new population is that they are committed to this proposition. They are on the cutting edge of the equity idea, and the idea that we all ought to have more of an equal stake in our system and in our economy.
One of the things you've said in your series in MinnPost, and you and I have talked about it previously on this program too, you've said, quote, for more than 50 years, Minnesota has had what you call a center-left consensus. Is this changing? We hear reports that Minnesota is a battleground state in the presidential election that could go either toward President Trump and the Republicans, or toward, it appears now, Kamala Harris is the likely Democratic nominee. Minnesota has not gone for a Republican candidate since Richard Nixon in 1972, the year before this came out. Is that center-left consensus changing, or is it strengthening, or what's happening in your view?
I would bring two perspectives on this. One, in presidential elections, we used to be, as recently as 1984, the bluest state. We're the only one that voted for Mondale in '84. Yeah. But he was a Minnesotan. Right. He was a Minnesotan. Generally, we are not as blue or as Democratic voting as we have been in the past. I think we rank about 15th on average in terms of the percentage that Democrats win presidential elections by. And so we're on the cusp of being a swing state. I don't think we're there yet. The more important fact to note, though, is that no Republican, since the advent of a much harsher, meaner, conservative, Trumpy type Republican, the MAGA type Republican, since that has really materialized in our state, Republicans have found it almost impossible to win a statewide election, not just for president, but they have not won a statewide election with that message now in more than 20 years, almost 20 years. So that may be the longest streak where Republicans have not been competitive in our history. Yeah. And one of the interesting quotes on this, I thought, was Tim Pawlenty after the 2022 cycle, in which Republicans were expected to make big gains. You had the George Floyd unrest, you had pandemic, you had all kinds of turmoil and a feeling that things weren't going well. It was all set up for a big Republican wave. It didn't happen. The opposite happened. Walz won by about the same margin as previously for governor. He had a trifecta in the legislature. And so I think this idea that we are veering right is just not true. I think we're at this next election, especially since President Biden has left office, Minnesota will be, if not comfortably, probably significantly blue in the presidential race. Hard to say. That it's very close on the House and Senate.
Right.
But
one of your observations that you made in the MinnPost series, again about our politics, is that you observe that Minnesota has been fertile ground for third-party movements or independent movements. Say a word about that.
Yeah.
What evidence is there that supports that idea that this is a unique place in terms of, in our history and even in our recent history, looking past major party candidates?
Right. Yeah, this has always been a state, and I love this about Minnesota, of kind of cantankerous, independent thinkers. And the preference for a third-party option goes back to the Farmer Labor Party, which was actually a very left party that had, it may be the most successful far-left party in American history. They elected governors, senators, I think.
Elmer Benson, Floyd B. Olson.
A dozen or so.
Right.
Coming forward, you had centrists like John Anderson in the 1980 election, who did very well in Minnesota. Ross Perot did very well, another centrist. Right. Jesse Ventura, Independence Party, one of the most successful movements.
Shocked the world. His election as governor in 1998, I believe it was.
So we have a strong left, even a radical element that has been more successful, and then we have the centrists. The other important thing to know is how moderate and liberal Republicans have shaped this state. Governor Arne Carlson's a classic example. But Dave Durenberger, and for about a 30-year stretch there, we had some of the most liberal to moderate Republicans in the country, and that explained part of Republican success here. Durenberger and Carlson probably had the biggest margins of any statewide office, and they were distinctively liberal to moderate Republicans.
Even going back to Republican Governor Luther Youngdahl in the 1940s, who was a reform-minded liberal Republican, but that's a brand in the Republican Party that there seem to be very few. It's pretty much gone.
It's pretty much gone. Yeah. Even further back, Harold Stassen was really a very liberal Republican.
Who was from right here in Dakota County.
That's right. Yeah. I wanted to go back to I was about to talk about Pawlenty. I know that he's been on this. He's a Dakota County guy, and he had a great quote after the 2022 election. It was something to the effect that if you haven't made a sale with your product in 20 years, it might be time to change the product or the marketing or both.
Interesting.
So I think that this kind of meanness that has crept into the conservative narrative is just it's not working here in Minnesota.
Turns off a lot of voters.
It turns off a lot of voters. It's not constructive. It is relentlessly negative, and it's not very Minnesotan.
Mm-hmm. I want to shift from politics now, if we could look at some other aspects of life in Minnesota that have changed since the Time Magazine article came out, and get your comment about this. Environment, clean air, and clean water. Mm-hmm. The dangers of climate change to Minnesota and its economy are rather significant. When you look at I recall the state climatologist saying a few years back, Minnesota is going to become warmer and drier. Mm-hmm. This has huge implications for our tourism industry, for agriculture.
For agriculture, we are one of the most agricultural states. And one of the, I think we're fifth in total value of agricultural products.
Of the goods we produce.
Right. We are way up there, disproportionate to our size even. Yes, tourism is very important. If you don't have frozen lakes to snowmobile or ski on, that's going to hurt. Obviously, I've seen reports that suggest that the rate of our climate change, especially the warmer winters, is greater than it is in other parts of the country. So we have a real personal stake, local stake in getting continuing the drive towards climate action and reducing greenhouse gases, but also water quality. This is the state that has got water in our name. We're the land of sky blue waters. I love our new flag, by the way. But what is more precious than Minnesota's water? It's something we all love. The lakes, the rivers, the wetlands. In my last episode of this series, I'm talking about, I set out a to-do list of top priorities to maintain this good life. And that ranks right at the top.
There's something that Minnesotans did too that is perhaps unique among the states. Minnesota voters actually passed a constitutional amendment some time ago.
Yes, raising their own taxes.
Raising their own taxes to dedicate money specifically to protecting our natural heritage, our lakes, our rivers, our streams, air quality, water quality.
Right. Almost no other state has done that, by the way. But we also raised taxes on ourselves in a statewide election. This doesn't happen in many other states, to fund arts. And I did a whole chapter on Minnesota's distinctive arts culture. It really sets us apart. We are an arts mecca between the coasts. It's not just the Guthrie and the sort of the fine arts, but it's increasingly with our diversity. There's just so much theater and dance and music that is richer than ever before, and we fund that to a degree very few other states do, and it is an undersung asset in our quality of life. I think it's super important.
When you talk about theater, and of course the Guthrie in 1963, when that was established, famous repertory theater, considered some of the best theater west of Broadway. But this has been fertile ground for people like the playwright August Wilson,
Yes.
who wrote a number of his plays right here in St. Paul. We've had any number of musicians, obviously Bob Dylan, Prince, who have had a global presence and influenced music and the arts. And they're not the only ones. We seem to keep churning out new people who are contributing to our culture and art scene.
We have among the highest literacy rate in the country by every measure of literacy and educational attainment. We're near the top. I like to point out that Minnesota produced the first American winner of the Nobel Award for Literature, Sinclair Lewis. And he criticized narrow-minded, selfish, small-town people.
in his town of Gopher Prairie, which was really Sauk Center, where he was from, I believe.
Right,
Yeah.
he would have loved this cover.
And also can't forget to mention F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Right, and we have a tremendous literary scene.
Right.
And recently, another Minnesotan won the Nobel Prize for Literature. You mentioned Dylan in the context of music.
Right.
He won it basically for literature.
That's right.
The body of his work is pure poetry.
Right.
Yeah.
Very interesting. And all of these things contribute to what you would call the good life in Minnesota, to be sure, right? It's interesting, too, when we talk about theater, I want to go back to that for a moment, the Penumbra Theater in St. Paul. Say a word about that and why that's such a unique contribution to our art scene.
Well, I think the Penumbra and Mixed Blood and a number of other theaters were among the first that really were of, by, and for people of color, black community in particular, and they have that distinction. We also have one of the nation's best children's theaters. So we're seeing this diversity play out in our rich literary tradition in a symbiotic way that I think is just so encouraging, and it's why people come here. It's why corporate executives, for years, it's been noted that corporate executives have to be dragged here, but then they can't drag them away. Their families immediately understand the quality of life here and how it's better, and the art scene is a crucial ingredient there.
Minnesota ranks secondly nationally in something called the Social Capital Index. Say a word about that. What is the Social Capital Index and what does it mean?
It would take a long time to describe all of the elements that go into this index, but it came out of work by Robert Putnam, who wrote the book Bowling Alone, lamenting the decline of cohesive community institutions in America. Everybody's off in their own little space, and they're not gathering together the way they used to. Or, some of this is a little bit nostalgic and ideal, and maybe just a little sentimental about the way things used to be. But there's absolutely truth to it. And so Putnam and his associates worked up an index to find out which states had the healthiest social index, kind of this glue that holds us together. And I think Utah ranked first. I think it's largely because everybody's a Mormon there.
Not everyone,
Not
but
everybody,
quite a few.
Right.
Yeah. Home
But
of the
Minnesota was a strong second. And I think that bodes well for the future. Through all this change and turmoil of the last 50 years, to still rank second on the social social
Capital Index.
Social capital. Right. There's capital. We all know how important capital is. That's money, raw bucks. But social capital is just important, the way we work together. And,
well, it's sort of like what you said, Dane, the glue that holds us together as a community,
Right.
that we really do feel like we're all in this together to make our culture, our society succeed.
And these are measures of volunteerism, citizen engagement, philanthropy, all the things outside of public policy. The way we work as together as a community. And I've seen this myself. There's this. I did a whole episode in this series about the so-called rural-urban divide.
Right.
I've had a lot of experience as a think tank leader in greater Minnesota, and I know that this divide is problematic and worrisome, but I've seen philanthropy, responsible civic leaders come together around things like making sure that the immigrant kids in southwestern Minnesota are getting the best possible education. Beneath all the nastiness that's often at the surface, people are working together in this state daily, every day, and it's a good thing.
In part 10 of your series, the last installment, you state that Minnesota, in your opinion, is at an inflection point. You particularly praise this session of the Minnesota legislature for enacting some of the most important progressive legislation since the 1970s. You mentioned universal free school lunch, the child tax credit, there's a lot more. Do you see this being sustainable, or is it going to change? And how do you respond to the Republican critique, if you will, that Minnesota had this huge budget surplus and it pretty much spent it, rather than giving money back to taxpayers? How do you respond to that argument?
Well, first of all, spending money is, in my view, and I think many others, is what you do with discretionary income. You blow it on fancy dinners out and travel and maybe a fancier car than you need. What we did with that surplus was we invested it, putting money into education, economic security, putting money into climate change or into climate action. Those are all really and truly investments. We're not blowing it on unimportant things. We're putting money where it will grow for us and pay back. The budget surplus was so large because of several bienniums of failure to agree, mostly conservative opposition to any kind of budget agreement to dispense with the surplus or to use it. It was just huge. It was one of the biggest surpluses in the nation of any state. And so, it looks like a big increase in long-term spending, but much of it was one term. Much of it was to increase police protection and to fund law enforcement. Much of it went into catching up with school investment. We're right here in Egan High School, one of the finest schools in the metro area, and it is a true resource. This is an investment.
I have to tell our viewers, when I met you at the door today to come into the studio, you looked around at this beautiful theater, this beautiful school connected to Black Hawk Middle School here in Egan, and you said, this is what happens when you invest in education.
Exactly.
You spend your money well. So
yeah,
very interesting.
A lot to be proud of.
Again, the series, they can find it at MinnPost. The entire 10-part series is published there.
Yes.
Really important that we have people like you thinking ahead about where we want to be as a state and framing what those options are. Dane Smith, author, journalist, and author of the MinnPost series, Reappraising the Good Life in Minnesota. Thank you for coming back and being our guest again on Access to Democracy.
Well, thank you, Steve, and I hope to come back again.
Of course.